Okay, so let's get started. We're going to be taking a look at setting up our pressure sensors in our Motec M1 systems. Now, configuring and setting up our pressure sensors is very straightforward. It's going to be a voltage to pressure scale lookup. We just need to tell the Motec what that calibration scale is going to be. There are some other additional details and channels that we need to fill out depending on which specific channel and resource we're assigning, configuring. Things like inlet manifold pressure, for example, might have a couple more details to set up and configure compared to something like oil pressure or fuel pressure. So they're all going to vary a little bit in how we're configuring them. We're going to dig into two examples here in this tutorial. We're also going to be discussing the differences between an absolute and a gauge pressure referenced sensor and when we need to use what specific sensor for the task as we're calibrating that pressure sensor. Let's jump in here and take a look at where we can find setting up our very first example, which is going to be the inlet manifold pressure, or also known as our MAP pressure sensor. We can see that's going to be what's used into the axes here for our main volumetric efficiency table. Also, if we're looking at something like our spark timing table, that's also going to be taking a look at engine load, which is a function of, in this case, the inlet manifold pressure, depending how we have things configured. So we definitely want to make sure that this is going to be calibrated correctly so that we have things in order for the fuel and spark timing. So let's jump in here. In my workbook that I supplied for the M1 training course, we're going to move from our tuning tab here down into our setup. And then in here, we can move into the basic inputs. Now, under the basic inputs, if we go down our resource list here, we're going to find the very first option as we come down here called inlet manifold pressure is what we want to take a look at here. Let's jump in and take a look first at the inlet manifold pressure sensor resource. This is pretty basic and straightforward. This is where we assign the analog voltage input that we've wired the signal wire from our pressure sensor into. In this case, I've wired my manifold pressure sensor signal wire into the analog voltage input number 6. Now, along with the signal wire, we're going to have two additional wires for a MAP pressure or a pressure sensor circuit. There's going to be a sensor ground, and then there's also going to be a 5-volt reference. So it's signal, 5-volt reference, sensor ground. So I've wired the signal wire to my analog voltage input. The next thing to consider here is going to be the calibration scale that we're working with for our sensor. If we take a look here, this particular example right now under the sensor calibration is set here to this Bosch sensor. We're going to find the details of our specific sensor if it's in the drop-down menu, as we find right here. We have a lot of different options in here. If we find that our sensor's in there, we can simply select it in that drop-down, and we're able to use that calibration scale that Motec has already derived and determined to be accurate for use with our M1. So if we go down here, again, we can look. It's going to give us the actual pin locations where we can expect to find the 0-volt or the signal ground, the signal, and then the 5-volt reference. So a lot of good information within this window here, depending on what type of sensor you're using. What happens though, if you do not have the pressure sensors that are found in our drop-down menu in this list right here, what are we going to do? We have to use what's known as our manual mode. Now, before we move in here and taking a look at our manual configuration and setup, I do want to mention that the inlet manifold pressure sensor will be a PSI-A or an absolute scale sensor. Absolute scale sensors are able to register vacuum and pressure. So we know that the engine's going to pull some type of vacuum. The manifold pressure is able to register and read that, and we need to know that information in order to deliver the proper fuel or spark timing to our engine. Now, we find that the PSI-A sensors are going to also reference our barometric pressure, meaning the pressure reading will change relative to our elevation. So as we move up and down in elevation, the pressure scale from our inlet manifold pressure, or PSI-A style sensor, will change as well. So it's all something to consider. We do not want to use a PSI-G style sensor or gauge pressure reference. Those sensors are sealed. They are not able to register vacuum conditions, and they will hold their 0 to 100 or 0 to 150 psi, let's say if we're looking at that type of sensor, they'll hold that calibration scale regardless of the elevation that we're at. We use that type of sensor for a fuel pressure or oil pressure sensor where we want that pressure to always be relative to that specific that we're measuring. We don't want it to change. We don't want it to reference anything with our atmospheric pressure. So inlet manifold pressure, PSI-A or absolute sensor. dealing with oil or fuel pressure, that's going to be a PSI G style sensor. So in the sensor calibration scaling here, let's assume that I have an AEM 3.5 bar map sensor. We're going to find in the drop down here, that is not going to be an option. If we go down here, we're not going to find that as a specific choice. We find a lot of options, but nothing that's going to be an AEM 3.5 bar map sensor. So what do we do? In this case, we're going to simply go into our manual option here. So let's select manual, and we're going to find that we have to go in and fill some of our information in here. So we find the very first thing, we have the diagnostic low and high voltage. We can't fill this out until we go and reference the data sheet for the sensor that we're working with. So we need to see what's the minimum and maximum voltage scale for our sensor. We also then have this inlet manifold pressure sensor translation table that needs to be populated, among other details in here. So this is going to be something that we populate coming from the data sheet for our sensors. So we can't fill out the diagnostic low or high, and we can't fill out this translation table until we take a look at the manufacturer supplied data sheet. Now, a few additional things here that I want to talk about. We have our inlet manifold pressure sensor voltage reference. This is traditionally set to absolute. We do have other options here. When we select these other options, this would be referencing the 5-volt circuit, either A, B, or C, depending on what type of analog temperature input we're using. So this is going to be an analog voltage input. So we're going to be sticking with absolute. The choices that we find here, these will scale the temperature readings relative to what specific 5-volt circuit we're tied into coming from the Motec. And if the 5-volt circuit changes in voltage, it will then renormalize that sensor reading, and that's specifically for temperature sensor input. So pressure sensors, we don't use that. So we'll choose.
Thanks for checking out our teaser clip. If you want to see the rest of this video and more than 500 hours of current EFI training we have to offer, make sure you click right here. If you want to go and check out more teaser clips from this training course, click here. And you don't want to miss any of the videos we're going to be releasing on this channel, so make sure you subscribe and click here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.